Well, welcome back, everybody. We are going to be looking still at chapter 26 about the agricultural revolution, particularly in the West. So what we'll be looking at here is talking about that American West, again, that sort of iconic image of cowboys and tumbleweeds and, the Western town and the shootout in the street and all that kind of stuff, but really not talking so much about those things because a lot of those are, of course, romanticized and so forth. But talking about some of the things that drew settlers to the West, and some of the things that allowed the West to be settled the way that it was, and particularly looking at agriculture, because ultimately, while there are numerous factors that initially drew people to the Western territories and, causing the settlement of Western states and all those things, it is ultimately agriculture that becomes sort of king, if you will, about when it comes to the West. And that breeds a lot of problems and a lot of issues that we're going to be looking at, how those things develop, and then furthermore how those things eventually sort of come into competition with the issues that are being raised by industry and the cities and this sort of industrial America versus rural agricultural America stuff kind of all coming to a head. So let's get started taking a look at the different things that might have lured people to the West. Now, of course, we've talked already about the idea of the West being this place of freedom, the West being this place to escape, that you could always go west to find new opportunity and those kind of things. Well, we want to talk for just a moment about some of the specific things that would have caused people to want to move west. One of the very first lures to cause people to move west, or the first things that kind of pulls people to the West is mining. The sudden discovery of certain precious metals, particularly gold. We've seen that going back, to the California gold rush. And then you've got in the 1870s, there was a big silver discovery in what is today Nevada and different things. So that's one of the first things that started drawing people to the West. And that, attracted a large population very quickly, because people would just rush out to a certain place. And it caused places to be settled, rather haphazardly in some cases. And it also meant that you had, towns that popped up overnight and then would soon be abandoned, turning to ghost towns when all the minerals in that area, the gold or whatever, had been depleted. So you get that image of the Western ghost town and all that sort of thing. But that meant that, people of all different kind of backgrounds and with all different kinds of skills piled in there to open shops and stores and hotels and banks and different things to serve people out there, provided a lot of opportunity for a lot of different kind of people, not just those that were in mining themselves. Lots of opportunities for women even to open boarding houses and saloons and those kind of things. And that's one interesting thing about a lot of Western states, that a lot of them were much more open to women's rights and gave women more rights. It was Western states that were some of the first ones to allow women the right to vote, in some cases decades before it was allowed nationally. Mining, while it does mean that you have pillaging of the land, you have pillaging of resources, it's quite abusive on the land for sometimes, it does mean that more people were moving out there, and the mining of that gold and that silver and all those things, that did help finance the Civil War, and that's helping financing the railroad building that was taking place, which opens up the West further. Another big pull west, particularly in the years immediately following the Civil War, was cattle ranching. We have the image, of course, of the cowboy, and sometimes we want to think that the cowboy was just some, loner that rode around on horses all day. But this was a job. This was a profession, and a lot more difficult and less glamorous than the movies and television tend to make it out. But cattle ranching became very, very profitable after the Civil War. Most Americans didn't eat a whole lot of beef prior to the Civil War because it just wasn't that available. Pork was kind of the meat of choice for most people. But beef prices, their beef is in greater demand after the Civil War. The prices of it are going up, so there's money to be made in the cattle industry. The railroads have a lot to do with that, because once railroads start to be being built, that meant that you could actually get cattle from where they were grazing to be slaughtered and sold and all that kind of thing. So there was money to be made in it. So the cowboy, while again we tend to, at least I know I did, just had this image of the cowboy as just being this kind of loner guy that rode around from town to town with his horse and all that. It was a real job. The job of the cowboys was to move these and to herd these cattle on what they call these long drives. Most of the cattle were bred in usually Texas, and you had to get those cattle, thousands of them, from Texas or wherever to railroad stations in Kansas and so forth, and so they could be sold. So the long drives are these months-long trips where cowboys are wrangling the herds and all this kind of thing, very, very long, ugly day. But that was what their purpose was. And so the cattle industry was a big part of it, and that's why the cowboy becomes sort of this iconic image of the West. The cowboy and the long drive, all of that only lasts for so long, though, because eventually what starts to happen is farming starts to really take over. And so a lot of that, or almost all of that wide open space that had been used for cattle grazing, ranching, the long drives, all that stuff starts to become enclosed, and that land is being privatized and owned by individual farmers and used for farming. So that puts an end to those long drives. So no longer could the cowboys just escort, such a formal word, herd cattle along these, miles and miles of open nothingness. Now that's, somebody's farm, and they're going to enclose that. One of the ways they were able to do that was with the invention of barbed wire. Barbed wire is one of several technological advances, actually, that contribute to the settlement of the West and the closing of the West and the closing of this frontier and the closing off the enclosure of this wide open nothingness that the West had for so often been. Because barbed wire meant that you could enclose a very large area very inexpensively and very quickly. Imagine having, thousands and thousands of acres and having to build and maintain a wooden fence. But if you can just string barbed wire up, that's pretty quick. So the life of the cowboy and the long drives, eventually that does die away. The cowboy becomes more the ranch hand, and cattle being raised on, smaller or rather large, but on ranches that were more stationary. So eventually it is farming that becomes sort of the king of the West. So that's what we're going to spend really the rest of the time looking at, is how that came to be and how farmers eventually overcame certain problems to make farming successful, but how that at the same time caused some new problems, and how farmers' issues become a major national issue and become a major part of the national political conversation by the late 19th century. So when we're talking about farming the West, we mean the Dakotas, we mean Montana, we mean those kind of Western places. Now, the Homestead Act, we actually talked about this in 10th grade, so this is a rehash, so hopefully you remember this. If you want more information about it, I'm going to link down below in the description box. I will link the video from, I believe it's chapter 12, where I talked about Homestead Act in my 10th grade video, so you can go check out that, and I'll try to remember to timestamp it. Exactly that spot where I talk about Homestead Act. But that was a law passed during the Civil War designed to encourage Western settlement, basically offering people land for free if they could move out there and do something with the land, make it productive, as they said. Which was much different than how that had been done before. They're giving land away instead of selling it. So this was really meant to try to encourage and incentivize people to move out west. And there are thousands of people that take the government up on the Homestead Act and move west in the years following. It is kind of a tricky thing, though. A lot of people are not successful with it because, again, the stipulation here was that you had to improve the land. You had to do something with it, grow crops or, raise livestock or something like that. And a lot of people found that incredibly difficult. Farming is not easy. It is not just dig a hole in the ground and plant some crops. It's very, very difficult. And in these Great Plains areas, there was particular challenges. So a lot of people end up not being successful with that. But, about 2 out of 3 probably give up on it. But 1 in 3 stuck with it and eventually were able to be somewhat successful farmers. The railroads also contribute to people moving out west, not just the Homestead Act, but with the railroads being built out that way, that would make it easier for people to be able to get there, for one, but to communicate. It means that you're not necessarily, you're moving out far away, but you have some kind of connection and you'll be able to get whatever crops you're growing, to market where they can be sold. You'll be able to get whatever livestock, those kind of things. There is that economic connection, not just a personal one, but an economic relationship between the West and the East Coast or wherever. So railroads probably contributed greater than anything else did to the settlement of the West. And we talked in that same spot where I talked about Homestead Act about the railroads and how that was incentivized by the government as well to try to encourage westward expansion. So those things are encouraging people to move out west. Now let's talk about what made agriculture successful. Because I mentioned that a lot of people, about 2 out of 3, gave up on trying to farm the land out there because it is quite difficult. The Great Plains area is very dry. The soil is arid. The climate could be, some might assume that it was not good for farming. In fact, for a long time, people referred to this Great Plains area as the Great American Desert, thinking that it was not well suited for agriculture, that you couldn't grow anything out there. And that's why it wasn't utilized that way for so long. But there are new innovations and new machinery, new technology that actually make that possible, such as the mechanical reaper, which allows wheat to be efficiently cut. It kind of did, the mechanical reaper did for wheat production what the cotton gin did for cotton, because wheat is the main crop that's going to be grown out in these Western Plains states and territories. The steel plow, having a plow that could churn up that arid, dry, difficult to work with topsoil, that's critical. And they called some of these people moving out west sod busters, because they're busting through that sod, that top layer that wasn't very fertile, churning the air up, getting turning the soil up, getting the air in it, and making it fertile. The plow was essential for that. So you're getting machinery that can not only harvest the crops more efficiently and in larger numbers to where you might actually be able to make some money off of it, but also technology that is allowing the soil to become more fertile. Another important thing regarding the fertility of the soil is irrigation. As I mentioned, it can be quite dry out there, and getting the crops watered when you're far away from a water source or you're in a long dry season was really important as well. So the development of irrigation systems is crucial in the development of farming of the West. And the way that those irrigation systems were powered was through windmills, like the one right up here. The wind would spin these underground turbines to pump water from maybe a stream or a river or something that might be miles away from your farm, but so that you could use it to farm your crops. So new machinery like windmills allow them to irrigate their farms and water them and actually grow something. And that leads to massive success of Western farming, a huge wheat boom coming out of the Western territories and Western areas. Wheat, of course, being the main crop that is grown in the West, and it explodes to where it is profitable for many, but actually becomes a bit of a problem. And we'll look at that in just a moment. So as the West becomes more settled, what we see is less of a West that was, say, the West of the Jeffersonian era, where it was just this vast, unknown, almost like outer space to us, kind of territory that was untouched, that was unblemished, that was free, that was open to anybody. Well, by the turn of the century, and certainly by the 1890s, that land is pretty much all but settled now. It's been organized into territories. Many new states have been added, and that was concerning to some, or if not, just a significant moment. Whether they were worried about it or not, it just kind of marked sort of a watershed moment for America. And that is addressed and talked about in Frederick Jackson Turner's essay called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And we usually just refer to this as the Turner thesis. And he was writing about the American frontier. We know that the frontier, pioneers, going places we've never been, being at the edge of civilization, and now we're going to move forth and settle something new. That has been a theme of America since the very, very beginning. And one of the things that Turner was saying in this Turner thesis was, that's over. We've settled everything we can settle. There is no frontier anymore because we've already been there. There is no more pioneering on this continent because we've already done that. But it talked about, he argued that had been very important, that had shaped the American character, that is what made Americans so individualistic. That is what made us so enterprising. That was what made us so daring and bold, because of that frontier, but kind of also expressing that was in decline, that rural America was in decline. And maybe expressing some concern about that. So the Turner thesis has to do with this sort of closing of the West, the end of the frontier, and the fact that America, while it could still grow, had kind of been, been settled to a degree, or to a very, very high degree. So as I mentioned, there are good things that go along with farming. Obviously, now you can be a really successful farmer out in the West, but it also came with a lot of problems. So we want to take a look at what some of those problems were that arose with this, and how this eventually evolved into significant issues for farmers, and why they eventually become a big part of the national political conversation. So let's take a look at some of these challenges that were faced by Great Plains farmers and agriculture. One of them is mechanization. The machinery, the new technology. You may be saying, well, you just said a moment ago that was great. That meant they could farm all these crops. They could, instead of producing, 10 pounds of wheat a day, they can do 1,000 pounds of wheat a day. Well, it's good and bad. It's a double-edged sword. Mechanization did mean that farming could be far more successful and far more productive, but it is also incredibly expensive. It means that in order to be successful, you're now going to have to be able to chalk up, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars for this machinery. And it's very, very expensive to operate, maintain. And it's also, you can't just say, well, I'll do it the old fashioned way, because if all your neighbors are using the machinery, you're not going to be able to compete with them. And so you're going to have to pay that extra money to keep up. There's another problem with mechanization that I'll get to in a second as well, but part of it is how expensive and unsustainable it makes it for some farmers. Railroad fees. I mentioned that the railroads in one way are great. They contribute to the success of the West. They are one of the reasons why people were able to be successful in Western farming, because railroads meant that they would be able to get their stuff from one place to the other. But it also comes with it high prices, because now they got to pay to ship their stuff. And as you can imagine, railroad companies were not exactly thinking, oh, let's cut the farmers a deal. Let's see if we can help them out. They're out for all they can get. And so they are charging really, really high prices. And they're, these farmers are already having to pay out lots of money for their machinery. Now they got to pay the railroads that are just, charging an arm and a leg for things. So very, very high prices for all of that stuff. And then going back to the machines, how that does make it more productive, but actually it makes it a little bit too productive. A big problem that farmers have in the West is overproduction. They are simply producing too much. They are producing so much of wheat that, what do you think happens to the price? Well, if there's lots of something available, more than people want, price goes down. So the price is falling, and we call that deflation. So overproduction leads to that deflation. The price is falling, going down. And if the price is falling, that means my income is falling. If I'm a farmer selling my wheat, my grain, and the price is going down, I'm not getting as much money from it. And by the way, I'm making less money, but my bills are going up because now I got heavy machinery. I got to pay the railroads all that they want. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to take out a second mortgage on my land. And now I got debt to pay for that. So debt becomes a major, major problem. All of this leads to debt. And farmers are stuck in this cycle of overproduction, deflation, and debt. And those are the things that they eventually want to see addressed. So let's talk about how farmers eventually start organizing themselves, working together to try to solve some of these problems, eventually even organizing themselves into a major national political movement. Hit it too soon. Here we go. Let's talk about some of the ways that farmers start to organize. One of the very first ways that farmers start to organize and start trying to work together to affect change was by forming organizations called the Grange. And the first ones were formed around 1867. The Grange, these started as like farmers' organizations, at first kind of like social organizations, because farming was a very isolating existence. You're out there in a rural territory. You can't see your neighbors. You're not close to a town. And so they originally kind of started as ways that farmers could just sort of get together every once in a while and have a social, have a picnic, as you can see some of these things up here, and have a dance. We'll have lectures, bring in some people maybe that can tell us some things about how to better grow our crops or about these crop diseases and that kind of thing. But then they start doing things like cooperatively owned stores. So instead of having to pay high prices for, manufactured goods, which they're having to do that now because farming has become very kind of one track. On that farm they produce grain and nothing else. It's not as self-sufficient as it used to be. So they're having to buy manufactured goods from those Eastern industrialists. So they would go in together and open a store so that they could, sell. It's like owned by farmers, working for farmers. So we will charge lower prices, be more generous with our lines of credit. We're not just trying to make money off of everybody the way that those, big corporations are trying to do that kind of stuff. They would also go in together and cooperatively own machinery. So instead of, this big mechanical reaper belongs to you, maybe it belongs to the Grange and we all kind of share it or help pay for it and all that kind of stuff. The Grange eventually evolves into something a little bit bigger and very, very similar called Farmers Alliances. You start to get Farmers Alliances, which again is very, very similar concept, cooperatively owned stores and businesses that were meant to cater to farmers, trying to, and also education, trying to educate not only farmers about better ways to grow things and stuff like that, but trying to educate the public. They were doing a lot of trying to educate other people that were not farmers. Hey, here's our problems. Here's what we're dealing with. How can we all work together as a society to help farmers out? So giving lectures, making pamphlets, all this kind of stuff. And all these farmer-owned businesses and farmer-owned companies, and you still see evidence of this today. It's still around. Think about things like Farmers Insurance, Alpha, that stands for Alabama Farmers. Those were insurance companies that were formed by farmers so they could offer more generous opportunities for farmers as opposed to the big industrialist who's just trying to make money and doesn't care about those farmers. It was meant to be a more farmer-friendly kind of a thing. So they are uniting that way. And then eventually the farmers' alliances start to become more political. That leads to the ultimate example of farmers uniting and farmers organizing politically. And that is through a political party that is first formed about in the 1890s called the Populist Party. When you think of the Populist Party, think of farmers. Now, the Populists were not just trying to cater to farmers. They were also trying to bring in industrial workers, like the factory workers that are toiling away in the factories for barely anything. So this is where the movement grows even bigger. The Populist Party, this is a full-blown political party. It's a third party, meaning, you still have Republicans and Democrats at this point as your two major parties. And this is one of those minor parties that springs up, but it actually lasts for quite a while and becomes incredibly successful. So it largely represents farmers' interests, but also laborers and, trying to unite sort of the little people, the downtrodden. Think of them as kind of the working folks against the rich people, sort of a thing. There's definitely a class conflict going on here. The Populist Party forms in the 1890s, and their platform, they first organized in Omaha, Nebraska. And their platform is called the Omaha Platform. And this is their agenda. The Omaha Platform is their list of things that they wanted to accomplish as a party. And they are running candidates in local elections, state elections, and eventually even in national elections, nominating people for president in 1892 and 1896. But let's take a look at the Omaha Platform and what the things were that were included. Probably the number one thing that the populists most get remembered for is they wanted the coinage of silver. We'll talk more about this a little bit later, but basically what they want is inflation. Remember, one of their problems is deflation. They want the government to start using silver money. The government had stopped using silver money sometime in the 1870s, and this actually goes back, if you remember in the Civil War, that whole greenback thing and wanting more money in circulation. Well, eventually they got rid of the greenbacks, and then eventually they got rid of silver. That always didn't sit well with farmers and poor people. They want more money in circulation so that they can have more money to pay off debt and that kind of a thing. So they want inflation. And so that's the reason why they want the coinage of silver, is to cause inflation and to put more money out there so that they can better pay off their loans, their debts, their mortgages, all those kind of things. So the free coinage of silver is probably number one for the populists. If you remember nothing else about them, remember farmers, and they want the coinage of silver. They also want things like railroad and utility regulation. We're going to get to it in some later chapters, but this is the day where big business is really becoming problematic for some people, big, powerful corporations, and little to no government regulation to stop them from, gouging prices, from doing things that were, not in the best interest of a lot of people, of doing things that were certainly not in the best interest of farmers, of taking kickbacks, of doing a lot of stuff that we might consider unethical or even today illegal. They weren't being regulated. And so the populists wanted that. Now, they probably wanted them regulated even more than they're regulated today, price controls and things like that. But they want the government to step in and do something about those high railroad fares and other kind of things. And, just feeling like they're being taken advantage of by these big, powerful industrialists. They also want direct election of senators. Keep in mind, at this point, senators were not elected by the people the way that that representatives are to the House representatives. Senators were appointed by state legislatures. The populists wanted to change that. This is a direct election of senators. We have that now. We go vote for those people just like we do everything else. But this is part of the populists wanting the system to be more democratic, wanting the system to be more accountable to the people, and wanting, saying, hey, senators ought to represent us, not the rich people that sit in the state legislature. So they want that direct election of senators. That would require a constitutional amendment. They want immigration restrictions. And this is the one that might make you go, well, what do the farmers have anything to do with immigration restrictions, remember that they're trying to bring in industrial laborers, and you can see how those people would not like immigrants because they would feel like immigrants were taking jobs and driving wages down. So that's kind of part of the platform that is particularly meant to sort of appease and bring in those industrial laborers. Before I was ready. So the populists, again, like I said, they show up about the 1890s, and they will continue to be a force throughout the 1890s. And we'll see kind of how this movement eventually sort of collapses. But it was very successful, particularly in your western states. You had some western states, like I'm wanting to say Nebraska, where like a majority of populists actually got elected to the state legislature. They become certainly the most successful third party there has ever been. But farmers' issues are becoming a big part of the national conversation. And what we'll look at a little bit later is how that eventually comes head to head with the interests of the industrialists and businesses and the issues of the cities and that kind of thing. So keep your populists in mind. We'll come back to them a little bit later. And next time, we will take a look at the businesses and the banks and the cities and all of that stuff and see how that is growing and changing in the decades following the Civil War. So we'll see you next time.